Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Brianna Kerber. My friends and colleagues call me Bree. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a policy communications associate here at Fresh Energy. Today on Decarbonize, we are going to be talking about the grid. In this podcast, I will be joined by Fresh Energy's own Mike Schowalter to discuss what's happening with the grid here in Minnesota and far beyond. We at Fresh Energy talk quite a bit about shifting our electricity generation away from fossil fuels to carbon-free sources like wind and solar. And the good news is that this is happening as we speak, but it's also important to keep in mind that as we transition toward our clean energy future, the grid has to be ready to handle these increases in renewable generation. And that means that we have to look at transmission, which can seem sort of complex because of its many moving parts. Fortunately, we have a Fresh Energy technical expert here today to dive in with us. And with that, let's get started. Hey, Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's another beautiful Minnesota winter day.
Yes, it's kind of cold though, I would say.
It was cold. It was really cold this morning, but nice and warm later. So great day to be out.
Yes. Well, for those of you listening who are meeting Mike for the first time, he is a senior policy associate on our clean electricity team. And he and the rest of his team are working every day to decarbonize the electricity sector serving Minnesota. And Mike's role in particular focuses on advocating for the decarbonization of our electrical grid, with special interest paid to something called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is essentially the entity in charge of managing our region's grid. And Mike, when Mid-Continent Independent System Operator is abbreviated, it's spelled like MISO, but it's actually pronounced MISO. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. MISO it is. And, there's a joke that I'd love to tell everyone right now, but I think they'll roll their eyes. So for those of you who are cooks out there, you can fill in the blank.
Awesome. Well, first, Mike, I'm hoping that you can sort of set the stage for us, get us all up to speed. Could you maybe give us a quick rundown of what exactly the grid is, what it does, and maybe touch a bit on some of its main components and the main players in managing it?
Yeah, of course. Gosh, well, the grid is huge. Obviously, it's something we see all around us. It's all those lines and poles and everything else. But it's much more than that. That's just the visible aspect of it. And really, it's what brings electricity from where it is powered. Maybe whether that's a power plant or a wind turbine, to our homes, to our businesses, factories. And there's a lot of moving parts there. I mean, I think you can really break it down into, I like to think about it as like a waterfall of electricity, and I'll be using a water analogy quite a bit today, but water, but it doesn't always work. So I'll point that out too. But but basically, the generator is like where the water is sourced, kind of trickles out. So that's your, your coal power plant, your solar arrays, whatever it is. And then it'll go to a substation, which basically ramps up the voltage of the electricity that's produced so that it can go into these transmission lines, which are for long distance transportation of the electricity. And the reason they do that is there's a little thing about electricity is if you have a really, really high voltage, it's much more efficient in how it travels long distances. So if you have a really low voltage, it'll just all the resistance, everything is in there, you'll lose a lot of electricity. So if you ramp it up real high to like, a few hundred kilovolts, then it's just much more efficient. So anyway, it goes from the generator, it ramps up to transmission lines for high voltage, and then it goes to then it ramps down at another substation, and that's what you'll see in neighborhoods. And then from there, your local utility usually will distribute that electricity at a lower voltage to different neighborhoods and eventually to your house.
Gotcha.
I know it's pretty obvious what it does. Powers everything that we rely on. But I think one of the biggest tricks, and this is a major exception to the water analogy I use, is that generation of electricity must always equal consumption. So every time you turn on your light switch, every time, if you have an electric car, if you plug it in, somewhere in the grid, which is geographically enormous, a power producer, a generator, has to increase their electric generation by that much, whether it's the 10-watt light bulb you have or your electric car feeding 220, 240 volts off the wall.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And I know you already touched a little bit on transmission and distribution lines, but do you want to dive into a little bit deeper what the differences are between those two?
Yeah. I mean, I think most of what we see are the distribution lines. These generally are smaller, safer, and that's really a good way to think about it. Is really just the size and the intent of the two types of lines. And I think to make it really to help illustrate this, it's probably best to look at. And excuse me, I just had lunch, so apologize.
No
Um,
worries.
but I think it's good to look at your home is your standard plug is 120 volts. We all know that. And actually, if you look at your house, the line that goes from the pole to your house, you actually see two lines, and each of those are 120. So and that's how you can power a 240 electrical appliance,
Okay.
whether it's your stove or an electric car charger. It's going to be feeding off both of those lines. And so we're looking at 120 volts, 240 volts, pretty low voltage, and a lot of that is a safety issue. And then
Mhm.
distribution, you'll see the line, basically those two lines will go to a little box on a pole. And that is a little like mini, it's just like a mini substation. It's not really a substation, but it's like a mini, it's a, gosh, I'm blanking on the exact name of it. But anyway, that is what brings the electricity voltage down from the distribution level,
Right.
which might be 1,000 volts, might be 4,000 volts in your neighborhood. Could be significantly higher if you're in a more urban or densely packed area. And so generally that's what you're going to see around your neighborhood. Transmission, as I mentioned before, you need that high voltage, and we're talking like 69,000 volts or higher
Oh,
generally.
wow. Okay.
So you're going from 120 in your plug to 69,000, and this can get up to 765,000 or 765 kV is a standard really high voltage transmission line. And so, as I mentioned, you're going to have much fewer electricity losses, so it's more efficient and it's much cheaper to then send electricity very, very long distance. And that's just because where we power our electricity is not right next to our homes, and we can get a little bit into
Right.
that too, talking about microgrids and rooftop solar and things like that. But I don't want to get ahead too much of myself on that kind of topic, because then we can go
Yeah.
real off the rails here in our discussion.
Right. Got it. But transmission, long distance, large amounts, and distribution, very localized in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I kind of like to think this is a bad analogy, but I like to think about it like a axle spoken wheel kind of thing, where
Okay.
the axle is the big transmission line that's bringing all the power to the wheel,
Hmm.
and then each of the little spokes off the hub, those are like your distribution lines, going
Okay.
to all the different users, spread out on the wheel edge, if you will.
Yeah, I actually like that analogy. Okay, so let me ask another question then. As we're talking about these different parts of this overall system, who runs or manages all these different parts of the grid? What does that look like?
Yeah, and that gets us back to MISO. They operate the grid as a whole, and they really operate the transmission side of the grid. There's a little bit of a gray area in distribution, especially nowadays, as maybe a more advanced topic, but you're looking at some they call distributed energy resources. These are things you can do in your home and connect to the grid that way. But that,
Okay.
again, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. But they operate really mostly the transmission, large scale transmission, and where they operate really is from Manitoba all the way down to Louisiana, Mississippi, and that's a huge,
Okay.
huge area. It's 15 states plus Manitoba, and their main role really is to coordinate all of the functions of the grid to go into, um, planning ahead to kind of predict how much generation we're going to need at a given point in time during a day, and then making sure that we have all of the different generators ready to produce that amount of generation. And maybe there's going to be a really big cold front coming through, and that weather is going to have a huge effect on whether people turn on their electric heaters. It may have a big effect
Right.
on suddenly it's going to be really windy in a place, and if there are wind turbines there, that's something else to think about. And so they really have to balance all of these different things that go on the grid, and it's a huge task. It's a huge task.
Absolutely.
Um, and this is also, I think, one of the tricky things with electricity. MISO operates the grid, but really they're in a contractual relationship with these distributors, with the transmission operators, with the power generators. They don't actually own anything.
Okay.
And so really what we're looking at here is the wholesale market for electricity. And so
Mhm.
they're trying to managing all these different moving parts to manage that wholesale market.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So I feel like when I think about the grid as someone who is still fairly new to these clean energy and climate spaces where the grid is something we talk about, I feel like it has to be massive, but I can't quite identify like what that is in my mind. Can you give us some numbers to help quantify or illustrate just how big it is?
Yeah, I certainly can. And like I said before, we're looking at 15 states in the mid part of the United States and Manitoba. But if you think about the number of transmission lines, and that's there in MISO. If you look at across the United States, about 300,000 miles of transmission lines in the United States. And what
Wow.
does that mean? I looked at that number and I was like, I don't know what that means either. So I was like, all right,
Right.
what's the circumference of the planet? Maybe that's a good way. So 300,000 miles, that's 12 times around the Earth. So
That's insane.
yeah, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And that's probably why you see transmission and distribution lines everywhere, because there are a lot of them.
Right. And that's just in the US. I mean, that is mind-boggling to me, but crazy. Okay, now we've had a chance to kind of talk a bit more about the grid, walk through some of its different parts, and it's got me thinking back to some of those everyday things like walking into the kitchen to turn on the lights as I'm ready to make a meal or plugging my phone in when I want to charge it. What can you tell us about how the grid works on a day-to-day, hourly basis so that I can do all of those things without really experiencing any hiccups?
Yeah, I mean, and that's really, I said MISO operates the grid, they operate the markets, but their main role, their main function really is ensuring reliability, making sure the lights will stay on. Um, and I'll get into that, but I really, first I want to talk about, the grid as a whole. It's not just MISO, it's not just here,
Right.
Minnesota, neighboring states. The United States really is split into, at least the lower 48, split into three main grids, or interconnects as they're called in transmission speak. So you have the Western Interconnect, you have the Eastern Interconnect, and then you have Texas, or ERCOT. And so Texas is its own thing. It's a little special. And they did that for reasons of avoiding federal regulatory requirements and things like that. And
Mhm.
so there are advantages and disadvantages to that, but we won't get too much into that today. But MISO does not. So we're in the Eastern Interconnect, essentially eastern part of the country, but MISO doesn't operate the grid in all of the states here. There are others. To our east, we have PJM. To our which stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, New Jersey, Maryland, though covers more than that now. To our west, we have the Southwest Power Pool, and then that's going to be basically not all of the states, but most of the states immediately to our west. And then there are other places like up in New York or in New England that are all part of what are called regional transmission operators, kind of like
Okay.
MISO. And then there are other parts of the country that actually don't fall under one of these RTOs. These are a little bit looser organizations of utilities that work together to regulate the wholesale market between themselves. And so each of these places, their main function is reliability.
Mhm.
So they're constantly, as I mentioned before, they're trying to predict what are the conditions going to be like on the grid, but they also have, in terms of weather or demand, supply, matching that. What if a power station needs repairs? How do we adjust that elsewhere? What if a power station goes out? How can we quickly ramp up production elsewhere? and and they also have certain reliability rules, that
Okay.
they kind of, in terms of different rules that people that transmission operators, generators need to follow just for that reliability piece. And so I want to get a little into MISO though. It's 15 states. There are 42 million people here. And their operations are, the day-to-day operation of the grid,
Right.
making sure it's reliable and safe. But they also have different markets that they use to make that happen. There's the real-time market is really just a marginal product, which basically means it's like a little bit extra, above or below,
Okay.
pricing. I'm probably not explaining it very well right now, and I apologize. But I think that the meat of that market operation happens in the day-ahead markets, where they're basically taking different bids for different amounts of electricity that could be produced or demand, and trying to match that up so you have a general idea. And then they have seasonal, like different types of capacity auctions and things like that. And we'll do another thing all about the markets, because
Yes.
I'm afraid that that'll take up its own bit of time there if we go into that now. And part of all of that, the planning, I think, is another huge aspect here. The grid is constantly changing, and there's a quote, and I wish I remember who said it, because I'd love to say their name, but there's a quote that the grid has not experienced as much change as it is now as it has since like the late 1800s, which is essentially when the
Wow.
grid started. And that's
Right.
because we're flipping over into a whole new model of how our electricity is produced and where it goes. We used to be, we'll get into this a little more later, I think, but it used to be, that you had a huge power plant, coal plant or facility, just a few large plants delivering almost all electricity to, load centers, urban areas, and things like that. And nowadays it's flipped. Instead of right now we have tons of generators, getting energy all over the place, and the location where those generators are is very different than where it used to be. And also with new technology and a greater adoption of markets, we have more opportunities to think of how to say this. Basically, more opportunities to creatively, trying to think of how to say this.
Take your time.
Yeah. No, basically we're democratizing electricity in a way that we've never seen. So it used
Okay.
to be that you had big power plants that were the electricity controlled, they made it and you bought it from them. And now, I mean, almost anyone can put solar panels on their roof, or
Right.
even, actually, when I lived in New England, prior to living here in Minnesota, I would I actually could choose who provided my electricity separate from the utility. So I didn't have to buy the utility's
Okay.
electricity. I could, and
Okay.
so through that was their way of allowing me to choose renewable energy as my source. And it was actually cheaper than what the utility provided. So that was great on both levels. And so in this so the grid is constantly changing. And as part of that is figuring out how it's going to change. I mean, no one likes change, especially those who are making a lot of money right now and comfortable in their positions. But we need to change. We need to change for environmental reasons. We need to change for just because we're electrifying the grid to an extent that we haven't seen in a long time. And there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and that's one thing that we do. Fresh Energy, we work with some of our partners to as part of these planning meetings that happen all the time at MISO, to basically figure out what is that change going to look like, and making sure that it gets us closer eventually towards a carbon-free grid and electric system.
Right. Right. I know that is obviously a key aspect of our work at Fresh Energy as a whole, but it's super significant to your role specifically. I feel like something else that you mentioned earlier is super, super important, and I think it's worth diving a bit deeper into. So you said earlier, generation must equal consumption at all times. It may be in other words, but can you expand on that a little bit and maybe touch a bit more on what that looks like in your mind?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this relatively simple. And there's something that first I want to get back to a little bit, that maybe helps set this up a little bit. I used
Okay.
water as an analogy for the grid. And I said that, it's a good analogy, but there are exceptions. And I think the one reason it's a very good analogy is that electricity is not something that, so electricity is, trying to think of how to explain this accurately. I like to think about it as like, you can think about it as like a bathtub or as a lake.
Hmm.
Generally, generators or power plants will produce electricity, and it actually, when on your, say on your bill with whatever utility you have at home, you're like, oh, I want to get only renewable energy. And so you enroll into that program. When I was in New
Hmm.
Hampshire, I was able to actually pay less for this. And sometimes, depending on where you are, you may have to pay a little more. It just depends on where you are. But you're basically being promised you're only going to get renewable energy. Well, that's not entirely true.
Oh no.
It's really an accounting thing. So the money that you are paying for that electricity, the utility is promising that, okay, we're going to use that money to only pay for renewable electricity. But what they're
Oh,
not
okay.
promising is that all of the power that goes to your house will be renewable energy. And the reason is because that's impossible, at least until we have 100% renewable energy grid. Um, and so the way I like to think about why, kind of a simplistic way to think about why that is because when a power plant produces electricity, they're basically putting electricity into a giant lake, and then all that electricity intermixes, kind of like water into a lake. All that water
Mm,
intermixes, and then so imagine a lake with a whole bunch of power plants with pipes going in, and then a whole bunch of users, homes, businesses with pipes going out. Well, that electricity goes into the lake, the grid, which is the grid, and then it comes
mhm.
out, and there's no way to control what electrons go where. It just intermixes. So,
Okay.
and actually, I'll look this up right now. This is actually going to be kind of a shocking thing for, I think, a lot of our listeners. Um, but if you go into
Real-time discovery.
real-time discovery, well, so MISO has these really cool real-time displays, where you can see what's going on with electricity. And let's see, I want to look at our fuel mix. So right now in the MISO footprint, there's 87 gigawatts. It's 87,000 megawatts of electricity being produced right now. I'll ask you a question. Let's have fun with this, Bree. Sorry to
Okay.
put you on the spot here, but the four largest sources of electricity right now are coal, natural gas, nuclear, and wind. Which of those do you think is the
Okay.
largest producer of electricity right now in this moment?
In this moment,
Hmm.
oh my goodness. I'm just gonna hedge my bets with wind.
I wish that was the case. It's wind is number three. So
Wow.
so 87,000 or 88,000 megawatts. Coal leads right now, 34,000 megawatts produced by
Gosh.
coal. Next is
Okay.
natural gas, then is
Mm,
wind, and nuclear follows. And so, and solar is a pretty small amount. It's kind of a cloudy day here, and I don't know what it's like down, maybe that's affecting it. But yeah, so that kind of gives you a sense. And this is pretty typical that, coal is leading the charge. Um,
okay.
so, you know, even though I'm contracting for 100% renewable energy, I'm, I'm still getting, coal is still a part of that. And that's just the truth. But um, on the good side, on the good news, that share has been going down over the years.
Okay,
And
right.
so, yeah. And so anyway, I've gone way far away from
No.
your original question, which was consumption equaling production at all times, a generation equaling production or consumption at all times. And this is where the lake analogy falls apart a little bit.
Okay.
With a lake, you know, basically a lake would be a huge, vast storage space. And we
Hmm.
have electric storage. We hear about it all the time in the news, but it's actually pretty minuscule currently in terms of, the amount of energy that's being produced. And so while it does help with some, hedging and things like that, and it may help with some reliability issues, especially if you use a battery generator at home or in a business. Um, it's still early days for storage and the effect that has on the grid. And so we really don't have a lake full of electricity. So now what I want you to
Okay.
imagine is that lake analogy. But instead of there being a lake, there's no lake now. Um, let's imagine instead of a lake, I'm making this up with the fly, so hopefully this pans out. We have a mountaintop instead of a lake. And so all
Okay.
of the producers' electricity, instead of putting their power or their water in this analogy in a lake, they're putting it on top of a mountaintop. And and in order for and then all of us who are consuming, instead of dipping into a lake, we're trying to catch what's fallen off that mountaintop. And so that's the thing that makes this more difficult than water or gas or most other natural resources, is you can't store electricity. And an essential reason you can't store it is because it's like 99% the speed of light. And it pretty much has no mass on its own, electricity itself. The electrons have mass, but the electricity that flows with the electrons does not have mass. So generation must equal consumption at all times. And this is a huge, huge like fundamental fact that MISO and any of these other grid operators must deal with all the time. And it really is something that governs a lot of market design and a lot of the day-to-day operating rules and reliability rules that go on. And so I kind of want to get into that a little bit. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And I like to think about I don't know, this image of like an old movie comes to mind where like there's some professor or mad scientist type in his lab, and suddenly like things start going haywire, and the lights start to flicker, and then suddenly a bulb pops. That's because the frequency of the electricity in that lab became unstable.
Okay.
And for the whole grid as a whole, the frequency actually must equal 60 hertz, which is, basically it's just in Europe it's 50 hertz. Here it's 60 hertz. It's basically the number of oscillations in a second, is how that is what that is. And any deviation from that frequency will have a major effect on appliances. All of our appliances are like that light bulb in the movie, are designed to fit 60 hertz, or if you're in Europe, 50 hertz.
Right.
And so if it goes too high, like in the case of the lab, you can send way too much electricity or way into that device, and it can malfunction. And this is why, almost like if you look at in your home, anyone listening, or in your office, count how many surge protectors you have around your house. It is a ton. And essentially what's that doing is it's protecting a surge of electricity or frequency deviation, something that can cause damage to your electrical components. And so and this is and this is Bree, tell me if I'm gonna tell me if I may be going a little too wandering off a little too much. But I think electricity, you think about our battery, your typical A battery, AAA, D cell battery. If you're old enough like me, you'll know what those are. Those are direct current. That's electricity is moving in one direction. But our
Right.
grid is not direct current, it's alternating current. And basically, instead of electricity moving in one direction, it's actually vibrating back and forth really fast. And that
Okay.
vibration is the frequency I'm talking about, that 60 hertz. And so when it vibrates too fast or it vibrates too slow, that has effects. And so, what caused, what causes this to happen? What causes these changes? And I talked earlier about, real-time markets and day-ahead markets, and MISO having to plan ahead and figuring out, okay, how much electricity will be produced at 9 a.m. versus noon versus 7
Right.
p.m. You're going to have, different amounts produced at different times of day. I mean, think about it. In the morning, everyone gets up, they turn on their heaters, they turn on their stove, they watch a little news.
Gotta have that
Offices are
morning
also
coffee.
morning coffee, the kettles, yes. There's a little bit of a peak in the morning on electricity use. And then it dips down during the day, and then evening, everyone comes home and they turn on the heaters again, they turn on their televisions, they turn on more lights, they cook more. That generally our highest electricity use is every evening. And then at
Okay.
night is generally the lowest electricity use. We're all asleep. And so, but anyway, all of that fluctuation of energy use, as I said before, every time you turn on your light or charge a car or whatever it is, someone a generator has to produce that much extra power. And so basically, I mean, if you look at the frequency, 60 hertz,
Mm-hmm.
that will raise, that frequency will get higher if there's a drop in demand. So if there's too much generation, too much electricity being produced, will raise the frequency. So if
Okay.
everybody decides, if we had enough listeners, we can do an experiment and we can ask everybody at I don't know, 12:01 p.m. on March 1st, let's just say. Fortunately, we don't have enough listeners to actually make this happen. But let's just say we were like the most popular podcast, and we will be one day, but we're not there yet. We could all agree on March 1st at 12:01 p.m. that we were gonna, like, I don't know, turn on our kettles. If we did that, you would see huge fluctuations, temporary, they'd be short in the grid, in that frequency, and there'd be a lot of people like going like, what the heck is going on here? And there'd have to be a lot of adjustments and with, maybe some batteries, maybe different peaking mechanisms, maybe spinning reserves, all these different types of generation units or reserve units that can help respond to that. But it would be something that
Mm-hmm.
MISO did not predict unless they were listening to our podcast. And so, yeah. Anyway, if we increase we all increase our electricity use suddenly, that's actually going to lower the frequency, get it below. And this is
Okay.
actually there's a kind of a cool aspect to this, because the generators don't need to be told that we're doing that. They'll actually sense from the change in frequency. They'll know by how their generator performs that the frequency has dipped low.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the way it's kind of like a taut string. So essentially, if you have let's say you have a hydro, well, let's just use a steam plant. I think it's the easiest way to think about it. So a steam power plant is basically turning this turbine, which that turbine spins at a set speed, and that's actually how they have the frequencies. Maybe it's like 3,600 RPM. I'm making this up.
Okay.
That's the RPM that it's spinning at, and it has these set of coils all around it,
Mm-hmm.
which are magnets that, I don't want to get into the whole how electricity is produced here, but basically, as it spins, that spin at 3,600 RPM, let's say, is what connects it to the 60 hertz based on the setup of their particular power plant. If we all decided to turn on our kettles at 12:01 p.m. on March 1st, that spin would actually slow down a little bit because of the pull on the electrical system as a whole. And so
Okay.
suddenly that spin would be a little bit less than, what did I say, 2,400 RPM? I don't remember, but whatever
It
it
was
was,
36 or something.
3,600. Okay. So as you can tell, as everyone listening can tell, I'm a little on the fly here this morning. But so that 3,600 RPM would suddenly go to like 30, I don't know, 35, 50 RPM. And so
Okay.
that would signal to the steam plant, oh, we need to kick in more steam to get this thing going faster, put more power to that prime mover, that thing that spins. And that's a way in which frequency regulation often has happened. Now, it takes a while to put in that extra steam and get things
Mm-hmm.
moving, which is why we have these other spinning reserves, batteries, other things that can respond much more quickly. So that's kind of like so apologize if that was a little long-winded there, but
No.
that's essentially like why that's, I feel like, summarizes one of the most challenging aspects of the grid and operating it reliably.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I feel like this is reminding me of the whole situation in Texas, and we can skip over that if you'd like to and move on to, the question of whether we can go fully 100% renewable, or you can touch on it a little bit. But I feel like this whole thing that you've just explained is kind of bringing that example back fresh into my mind of one of those instances where people weren't able to plan for a certain instance in reliability and instability in the grid, and therefore there were unexpected results that happened. Is that the case, or is it something different?
Um, yeah, I mean, the thing with Texas, I'd love to talk about Texas a bit. It was one of these things where they did know that that kind of cold air mass could happen again. It happened about 10 years prior. There was a report saying we needed to be doing more stuff to winterize all of our fuel systems, and it was mostly ignored. And so when it happened again, I guess it wasn't a big surprise. But as I mentioned before, like that, 60 hertz being really, really
Mm-hmm.
important. What happened in Texas was that generation was not able to keep up with demand. And so that frequency was
Okay.
dropping down below the 60 hertz. And, there's a huge stability aspect to this because all the power systems, are doing that. So they're synced together and generating at the same time, so that sine curve, doesn't cancel itself out. If you have everyone just putting in at random frequencies, it's going to cancel itself out. And then you'll have, basically the grid will crash. And so one of the things they needed to do is they need to maintain that grid at 60 hertz. People were demanding way more power than the power producers were able to actually put in the system. And so the only way they could prevent the grid as a whole from collapsing was to do what they call load shed, which is basically shutting off power to large sums of people. And that may seem like a pretty awful thing to do, but the alternative was, so basically they had two choices. We can take off electricity for large swaths of our customers for hours, if not days, or we can risk the grid collapsing as a whole and not having power for weeks, if not months. And so they chose the lesser of two evils. And and this actually kind of gets to some interesting things about the different grids that we have, and I think the nature of how geography is intertwined with stability and reliability. Texas, as I mentioned before, is its own interconnection.
Mm-hmm.
So when they were having this problem, and basically, this is another thing I want to get into. A lot of people were blaming wind power and renewable energy, but really, if you look at all the reports that came out afterward, the bulk of the problem came from the gas industry and pipelines that were freezing, or gas power plants that were freezing because they were basically outside and not in insulated areas that like they are up here in the north.
Gotcha.
And so Texas, if this were to happen, and say this were to happen, same air mass, and actually the same air mass was experienced. I don't know if it was as cold, but in Mississippi, Louisiana, and
Mm-hmm.
Arkansas, and those areas, just a little bit further to the east, they could have that same challenge. They could have, theoretically, they could have, the same number of generators going offline, but Texas is generally not interconnected with the rest of the country. The southeast, or the south just east of Texas, is interconnected with the rest of the country. And what happened during, when Texas was suffering from all of these problems, we were actually getting a lot of electricity was being sent from the East Coast, like, PJM, which is, east and northeast, was being sent over into MISO, sent down into SPP, really to help this, help respond to a lot of that was going on. Texas does have some have some connections to other grids, but it's not like what we have in the Eastern Connect as a whole. And so they really weren't able to pull on that geographic resource that we were in the East. And so yeah, I mean, that's something that, that's one of the reasons why we were a little bit more robust here in
Right.
Minnesota and other states. It's also a reason why you may hear the term called macro grid is often talked
Hmm.
about, and the connection that has to renewable energy sources is pretty good. Because so macro grid is basically the idea of a macro grid is to fully interconnect the eastern and the western interconnect, so that electricity can be more widely shared between the two regions, much
Okay.
more widely than it is now. And it's not just between the Eastern and Western interconnect, it's also between us and SPP, which is that other grid operator to our west, or
Hmm.
PJM to our east. It's also increasing a lot of electricity flows that go that way. And what that would actually allow is, um, you know, basically the East Coast could power itself from solar produced in Arizona, let's just say. And
Interesting.
so while the sun's fallen in the East Coast and there's having a ton of demand, because the evening is when the highest energy consumption has, well, that happens to be, pretty, Arizona is still getting a lot of sun at that time. Um, the same thing, there could be wind resources elsewhere in Oregon or even in the upper Midwest that could then power that long distance at a much greater capacity than can happen today. And I think Texas was kind of a good example of, if you don't have that ability, how tricky it can be to share resources across. Um, so yeah, I guess I get a little ahead of myself. It could happen here, what happened in Texas, but um, you know, we're built up for the cold, and we can
Right.
draw on resources from our neighbors in a way that Texas just could not do.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks for answering my Texas question. It popped into my head and I figured I'd put it out there since other people might be wondering the same thing. So now I guess let's move forward a little bit to maybe a bit bigger picture question. So there's this whole other question of the challenges we might face as we transition to more and more renewables. And I feel like sometimes I hear people say, we can't go 100% renewable for XYZ reason. Is there any truth to that, or what do you think?
Um, I'd say it's not true. It's challenging. It's a technical challenge for
Mm,
sure. And I kind of got into earlier, having a nationwide grid or a macro grid would really go a long way. Um,
right.
but I actually think, batteries, even though the technology is still relatively early, it is going to, I believe it's going to fill that gap. One example comes to mind, which is a really cool pilot program going on up here in Minnesota with Great River Energy, Great River Energy is one of the main utilities here, but then Form
Mhm.
Energy is a company. They're putting together a 1 megawatt battery, not that big, but it has 150 megawatt hour capacity, discharge capacity, which is pretty huge, because then they could basically store electricity, or they can, it's like it's arbitrage. They can go ahead and charge that battery up when there's plenty of electricity and it's really cheap. So in the middle of the night when the
Okay.
wind's blowing, or during the day when there's lots of sun but not a lot of use. And then in the evening or early morning, they can discharge it when the prices are higher. And so basically they're arbitraging. They're able to buy low, sell high. Um, but the nice thing about this, most batteries you look at now, you look at the lithium batteries that are most prevalent now that you'll see in EVs and stuff. Generally, you're going to see 2 to 4 hour discharge abilities for those batteries, which gets us to the next few hours, but doesn't get us to the next day, and it doesn't help us
Mm,
meet a problem if we have like a heat dome where there's not a lot of wind being produced. Well, this is where something like Form Energy's battery can really help. The 150 hours, what is that, a week? It's a lot. It's a lot of capacity there that they have available. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you'll hear a lot of talk about, peaker plants. We need to build, I'm not saying this, but people will say we need to build more gas
mm,
peaker plants, which are basically these really, they can jump online real fast. And they're really good at, producing electricity when demand's really high, or when the ramp downs for some reason is really fast. But batteries can fulfill that function just as well. And I think by the time, I know one thing here, Fresh Energy, maybe I'm getting a little bit over my skis on this one, because this is not what I work on. But there is many of the utilities want to build peaker plants, but we've been really good at advocating to say, no, actually, by the time you get those built, battery technology will be mature enough that that's really what you should be doing, because it'll be a lot cheaper and it will, better for the environment, and just a lot more reliable, really from a price perspective. And I guess that's one thing I can maybe get into a little bit later. I'll keep a mental note on that one.
Okay.
So while that's not true, that we can't get to 100%, the idea that we can't get to 100% renewable grid, I think there is some truth where that perspective comes from. As I mentioned, the sun isn't always shining, wind isn't always blowing. We know that. So there is a challenge there with renewable energy. But I've talked a lot about having different geographical, resources which you can draw on, and storage being there as well. But also remember what I was talking earlier about our AC system, alternating current system, the frequency bit. Wind and solar are essentially they're DC power systems. They don't do alternating current, so you need to have some sort of what they call synthetic. There's no one. Let me back up a bit. There's a challenge there, and this is getting really, really, really complicated. So I'll try to make it brief. But remember how I said that your power plant can kind of sense when the frequency is dipping or when it's getting too strong, and it can adjust its its power output within to make sure that speed of that shaft is a constant 3,600 RPM. When you don't have a rotating prime mover like that, like you don't have that with solar, and you don't have that with wind, even though the turbine's spinning, it's not a prime mover in the same way. You then don't have that. There's something called inertia, where basically, because you have all these generators all over the country spinning at the same frequency, when something happens, like kind of the inertia of that spinning helps it recognize what's going on, and it reacts. You don't have that same ability in wind and solar, but you can control that digitally with technology, and so it's a technical challenge, but it's something that we are doing, and we're getting better at. And there's also the sun's not always shining, but we have solar storage, solar and storage, called hybrid facilities. They're seeing more and more of this, and so if I'm a solar plant, I'm producing most of my electricity at noon, but electricity is much more attractive price point for me at 7 p.m. So you're seeing more and more projects where individuals or companies are combining, doing a hybrid resource where it's both solar and storage, and then they're having whatever excess solar they're producing in the middle of the day, they're just shifting that power till later in the day. And this is where our mountaintop and lake analogy can maybe fit in. We're starting to get puddles, and these puddles will get bigger over time, and we will have a lake eventually. And then, like I said before, just the macro grid, the greater we can connect geographically, the more, if the sun's not shining here, it's shining somewhere else. And a cool thing about the sun and the wind is generally it's windy at night, and it's sunny during the day. And that's a great complementary aspect of those two sources.
Very much so, definitely. So we've talked a lot about how our transmission system is basically like, in a way, the roads and bridges of electricity. It's that system of wires, poles, and stations that's moving our electricity from one place to another. And I am sure that it requires maintenance, updates, sometimes replacing parts, equipment. What is the process for changing that system? I know you talked about it a little bit earlier, but how do we experience that? How might that show up in customers' electricity bills, for instance?
Yeah. I've talked a lot about the technical challenges, and we generally the technical challenges are something we can pretty easily overcome, and that we are overcoming. And there's a lot of money and resources and time being put into those things. But what you're talking about, really, the changing of the grid, the transition of our grid from a fossil fuel based power system to one that's renewable. I like to think of that it's a bit of a human problem in the sense that we need to
Mm.
agree on how to plan it. And as I mentioned before, there are tons of generators, there are tons of transmission line owners, there are tons of utilities, there are people who own lots of oil and gas resources, and they want to keep providing oil and gas resources.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are concerned about those reliability challenges I mentioned, and maybe don't have as much faith in the ability to overcome them with overcome them that you and I might have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the hard things that we have to do is we all, despite these different perspectives, we have to really agree on this. And this is really what the whole planning aspect at MISO, which I referred to earlier, it's
Mm-hmm.
all these different stakeholders getting together and trying to agree on a path forward. I think there is a general consensus that our grid is becoming more and more renewable and will become dominated by renewable energy. I think some of it is, some of the challenges are, how will we get there? Who will pay for that transition? You mentioned costs. Transmission is expensive. But one thing I like to remind people is, you may hear billions of dollars spent on transmission, which is a lot. Surely that's going to show up on my bill. But historically in the last 10 years, and we've seen 10, 20 years, and we've seen transmission, large transmission projects built in order to facilitate renewable energy, being, new renewable energy resources coming online and being a part of the grid. That's actually resulted in a cost savings because renewable energy is cheaper. Is cheaper and cheaper every year, and it's actually cheaper now than your traditional gas and coal and nuclear power. And so that's part of it too. If you have a lot of money or a lot of time or a lot of other whatever, if you're invested in having natural gas or coal, transmission may not be what you want to see, because transmission brings competition. The competition that transmission brings is solar and wind. Solar and wind is price competitive, and if your resource becomes more expensive, you're going to be able to sell less and less, and suddenly you're going to be out of business. And so that is a big challenge. I think I don't want to get into motives and why.
Right.
I think people generally I try to be gracious with where people come from. I try to see different perspectives and where they are. Maybe it's, I don't want to speculate. I'm not going to speculate on the podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so that's one challenge. And I think, but another challenge that I'm very cognizant of, and we at Fresh Energy are very cognizant of, is what will new expanded transmission look like? One of the things that I think is a general consensus in the industry is we want to use existing rights of way to the extent we can. That's so we don't have to, put up new towers and new places where they aren't now. But at the same time, likely we're not going to only be able to do that. Another option is burying lines, which I haven't talked about high voltage direct current transmission. That's something that is a little bit more cost effective for that kind of transmission line services to bury it. And there's something called the Sioux Green line. They propose to have a very long distance transmission line up here in the upper Midwest that would be 100% underground, so you wouldn't see it. So those are options, especially as we go towards a macro grid, that might be more and more accepted and more talked about. And I think a big thing too is who is the big question is, who is the community when we affected this? Is it really broad, us as ratepayers? Are we the community? What about the landowner who if a new tower is going to be put in place, and how is that landowner going to be compensated? And maybe they are compensated enough, but what about the neighbor who likes their view? And so it's going to be hard. And I think that one of the best things we can do is really learn from our past. Not make the same mistakes. I think a lot about I used to live in New England, and I was there when there was a big project called Northern Pass, which was this this long distance transmission line project where it was bringing really cheap electricity from Quebec using their hydro resources, so it was carbon free, and
Okay.
bringing it to southern New Hampshire, but mostly for Massachusetts benefit. Um, but when it was originally proposed by the company who proposed it, Eversource, they didn't really talk to the community that would be most affected by the transmission line, mainly in central and northern New Hampshire. They basically just kind of looked at it technically, said, okay, this looks good. They went in and they proposed it. And they were completely stunned when people were like, but, wait, you can't do that. You can't, if you don't know New Hampshire, northern central part of New Hampshire, it's where the White Mountains are. And if you get north of that, there's this wonderful, just beautiful, plains essentially. Um, Lots of tourism, so beauty
Mm.
is a very important part. And they spent, I don't know how much money, but it was a lot of money. I want to say it was like $1 billion was spent in terms of just, and I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that, anyone, but it was a lot of money was spent on coming up with new proposals, talking more with people. And the proposal they had finally was very different than the one they had originally. But I think by that time that happened, people were just so upset and negative that it wasn't built. And this is a challenge. This is a challenge, continue to face. It's happening in Maine now. It's happening, for good reasons, and there are some real good reasons behind this. And so I think the best thing we can do is try to get ahead of it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's like the third rail maybe of transmission. I don't know if that's not true, but it's a huge challenge. And I think we don't want to double down on past wrongs. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes. We want to make sure that people are heard.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to get to a carbon-free future here, a carbon-free economy, transmission is part of it. And that's going to mean, more towers. And so I don't know. Being in the industry, I see transmission towers and I think they're pretty awesome looking, but I get that not everyone will share that. So
Yeah. Yeah. But I like what you said. And I think the core of what you kind of focused on there is that everyone really does mean everyone. Everyone has to be involved in making sure that we're proceeding and moving forward in a way that benefits everyone, and that is a shared vision for how to do that. It's
yeah,
a group effort.
it is a group effort, but at the same time we have to recognize that not everyone's going to be happy either.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
And this actually kind of gets me thinking, and I apologize if you're going to ask me this anyway, but oftentimes people ask, well, what about microgrids and doing everything local?
Mm.
And it's not really an either or kind of thing. It's you need both. Um, if we were to do everything locally, it would actually be extremely expensive to have all of the electricity resources that we need locally to power only what's local. And you wouldn't have some of the geographic, reliability benefits that I talked about. You also just, it's not very windy here in Minneapolis, but it's incredibly windy in southeast or southwest Minnesota, or in
Mm-hmm.
Iowa, or in the Dakotas. And it can get sunny, especially on really cold days, but not nearly as sunny as it is in other parts of the country. And so, do everything local. I think it's important. It's really great for, when there is an emergency, like what happened in New Orleans when all of the transmission towers went down.
Mm.
And that's a whole other conversation as
A
to the
whole nother
history behind why that
conversation.
happened. But that basically it could have been prevented. But it's useful for events like that too. But we need both really if we're going to get out of this fossil
Mm.
economy that we're in now and into a renewable one.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of getting out of the fossil economy and into a renewable one, we and other clean energy and climate advocates like to throw out this term a lot, and we call it the grid of the future. So as we look to build that grid of the future, I'm guessing that we anticipate seeing a lot more innovative solutions, some of which you've already touched on, for basically getting cleaner and cleaner energy into more and more places. But can you peer into our collective future for the grid and give us some details on what that actually might look like? Like what is next for the grid?
Oh gosh. Well, we are seeing some of it now already, which is good. We're that evolution's already started. But if you look at what the grid was like in, say, the 70s, you had these huge, large power plants, very few of them. But nowadays, but more and more we're having a more distributed resources, and that's actually a term within the transmission industry that means something else. So I apologize, but basically you're having more and more energy producers in more and more different places. It's a much more diverse network, and so and then the locations of where those factories were, the power plants were near water sources, because you needed water in order to cool a lot of the equipment that was going on. And that's not necessarily where you have the most sun or the most wind. And so a lot of the new resources are in very different places. And so that's one of the reasons why this transmission, we can't just put a whole bunch of wind at a coal plant that we're closing down. It may not be windy there. We need to actually, have other lines going to other places. But you're also going to have, okay, and now I'll use it correctly, distributed energy resources, or, or basically, storage, a more localized renewable resources. It could also be something like demand response, which is basically, if I own a big factory and I can produce things 24/7, but my electricity is really can get really expensive at 7 p.m. on a really hot day, or when everyone comes home and is turning on their AC, I can be paid to actually shut my power usage down. That's a demand response, and that's something else that's in the market. So that's like an example of distributed energy resource that we're going to see more and more of. And you can even do that at your house. I know with Excel, at least we have a smart thermostat at our house, and it keeps bugging me to enroll in one of Excel's programs, where it'll actually raise the temperature a little bit in the afternoon when it's really hot, to help take some resources off, some generation resources, make them more available for use elsewhere, and bringing the total energy use down. The reason we don't do it is not because I've been too lazy. I've tried to get into it. It's actually we have time of use billing, and so our energy is actually already really expensive from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. in the summer, and so we already have an incentive to make it a little warmer because of that. And then I think we'll be more undergrounding of lines, as I talked about, things like that. But I think really the idea, I think that if there's one thing to take away, is we're going to see a greater democratization of our energy resources, electricity resources in this country, which is only a good thing. Puts us all a little bit more control of what we're doing and how we're taking part.
Yeah. I know at Fresh Energy, as we talk about modernizing the grid, we try to bake into everything we do that we're bringing everyone along in the process. And that's because we know that, we're not doing this in a vacuum, that the clock is ticking, and we know that we need to act fast in a strategic and measured way with the resources and tools that we do have at our disposal. So.
No, and there's a total balance with this, making sure we get it right and wrong. And we've touched on that a lot, learning from our mistakes. But at the same time, it's recognizing the real challenges that we actually do face. It's that old, frog. You put a frog in a pot of water and heat it, it'll be boiled alive. But if you throw a frog in a boiling pot, it'll jump out. And and we're have you not heard of that, Bree?
I have never heard
of that.
For those of you listening, Mike can see my face, and I was looking at him like, I've never heard this example in my entire life.
So maybe it's an indication of my age. I don't know. But yeah, so we're with the climate crisis and everything that's going on, and environmental crisis as a whole, and it's hard to see just the urgency of what we're dealing with, because the changes are so minuscule day by day. And it kind of reminds me, did you see the movie Don't Look Up?
I did. It popped up on my Netflix the other weekend, and I definitely watched it.
Okay, so I'll try to. If anyone who hasn't watched it, you should. It's a fun movie. It's yeah. Anyway, it's a fun movie. But it's also very like perfect for the times too.
Mm,
And I don't think I will give anything away, but the basic premise is that scientists discover. And if you don't want to hear anything, you just want to look at it, just plug your ears for 30 seconds. I promise I'll be done by then. So anyway, scientists discover that an asteroid's going to hit the planet, and we've got like 70 days or something like that, to
mhm,
live. And they go to the president. Eventually, they find their way to the president's office, and they're like, asteroid's going to hit the planet. And the president, one of the aides of the president's like, oh, but like, are you sure? Like, what's your certainty? They're like, oh, like 99.999% certain that's going to happen. And the politician is like, oh, so there's a chance that it won't happen, even though it's, minuscule. And this is just an example of, it, sometimes big challenges like what's going on in the climate are really hard to take in. And we all
mm,
got to get there at our own time. I'm in my 40s. I know I've always been really really interested in having a cleaner environment and all that kind of thing. And I feel like I've been involved in climate issues for a long time, but I didn't fully understand the just severity of the problem, and until later in my life. Not late, but like it was an evolution, is what I'm trying to say. Even
yeah,
though I recognize it as being a serious problem, I didn't, I think, fully appreciate, and I may still not fully appreciate the extent of our problem, and that's something that we each have to deal with in our own time. But you know, we the sooner we can figure that out, the better. And so anyway, I don't know why I bring up oh yeah, and so plug your ears again for 10 seconds. The response from the president is, even though they had this, this like near certainty of it, they're like, oh, we'll just take this into consideration. We'll
mhm,
think about it. Um,
yeah.
but you knew they weren't going to act on it. And I don't even know why I brought this up anymore, Bree. Can you remind me?
I think, it's like you said, it's illustrating just how massive this issue is and how there
Yeah.
are so many different aspects that require our attention, and how we are working in concert with so many different people in different capacities, in different places, to try to address the problem at the scale and the pace that is required of us. And like you've said, we're not doing this alone, obviously.
No, we're not. We're not. And and it's a huge problem that there's a lot of momentum into how we got to where we are now in our economy. And one of the big tricks is how to we don't want to just slash and burn the economy. Some may advocate that's the way to go, but that's not, I don't think that's our stance here at Fresh Energy. We want to continue to have a strong economy where people have a good life and everything like that. But we want to figure out how we can better embrace the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
um, how we can actually help the world grow and embrace ecosystem services or whatnot. And I'm getting beyond energy here a little bit, but that's, I think, a big part of what we think about. And you're right, Bree, we don't work on this alone.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of organizations that we're working with across the country. And MISO, we work directly with places like Clean Grid Alliance and the Sustainable FERC Project, NRDC, the Union of Concerned Scientists, Southern Renewable Energy Association, 350 New Orleans. Like, I can keep going and going. There's a lot of
The list
organizations we
goes
work with,
on.
but
Yeah.
these organizations and others are, and with us, we're doing a lot of good work. We're pooling resources, working together to really help transform our grid so we can have 100% carbon-free economy as soon as possible.
Definitely, definitely. So much of our work at Fresh Energy is done in coalition with other organizations. And I think that I can confidently say we are able to be as successful in the work that we do because we're not doing it alone. And as cheesy as it may sound, that includes every single one of you listening. I know just as well as you that Fresh Energy's grid work can sometimes feel painstakingly slow and seem super challenging. But we like to say that it's often the most rewarding, because the grid that we work to build today is going to serve us generations into our clean energy future. So thank you, Mike. Mike's on Twitter at Schowalter1. That's OWALTER, and then ONE, as in the number one spelled out. Thanks, Mike, for taking the time to talk with me today about the grid and its many moving parts.
Thank you, Bree, and for anyone who's still listening after an hour of rambling. Thank you for sticking with us. I really appreciate it. And I didn't tell Bree I would do this, but I'm thinking here, maybe if you are listening and you want to do something, definitely, you probably already are doing a lot, but check your utility bill, see if you're enrolled in some kind of renewable energy program, see if where you live there are options to purchase your energy from 100% renewable energy source. Those are things that send strong signals to utilities that, hey, there is a demand for this. So, if each one of us do this, that does help. So that would be my ask of our audience today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we will be continuing this conversation in the coming months. So stay tuned, keep an eye out for a more detailed MISO specific kind of explainer blog from us as MISO continues its long-term planning. That's something that Mike and I specifically will be working on. And thank you again to everyone listening for wading through this often very technical topic with us. I don't think we got too into the weeds the whole time, but there might have been points where it strayed. So thanks for sticking with us. If you are hungry for more information or would like to get involved, you can always visit our website, fresh-energy.org. And quick plug, if you're free next Thursday, February 3rd at noon, join Fresh Energy and Energy News Network for a virtual panel discussion with journalists and advocates about what equity in climate and energy journalism should look like, as well as what steps news organizations can take to actually move in that direction. You can save your virtual seat by clicking the events tab in the top left corner of Fresh Energy's website. We hope to see you there. Thanks again, everyone, for hanging out with us today.